And now they are trying to use what they do the best. And they still, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine probably is the only country, plus Estonia or Finland, who's standing up in the field of the information warfare. Our country, the United States, has nothing on them in the field of information warfare.
No, we are losing that war badly.
Europe is struggling. And so thank God for the former Eastern Bloc countries who understand what they're dealing with.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of On the Edge. Our guest is someone with whom we've done a lot of collaboration in the past. It is Zarina Zabrisky. We talk about a wide range of topics because as a journalist, she covers these various things, notably, of course, the daily war crimes and the terror that is happening in the town in which she bases herself, Kherson, but she's also an Odessite. It allows us to talk about a wide range of things here in Ukraine, but also regionally and indeed globally. There's really no need to say anything else because we talk about it all. So, Zarina, lovely to have you in the studio for a change as opposed to remotely. So thanks for coming in.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Phil.
We've had you on before to talk about one of the most egregious crimes that I think Moscow is committing in Ukraine, and that's what's going on down in Kherson, namely in terms of the drone aggression that is going down there. I don't even call it warfare because it's terrorism. They're hunting civilians down like animals, like a safari, as we have often now called it. What's the current situation generally with the drone war in Kherson?
It's getting worse, Phil. So it was labeled human safari, and to my utmost, awe, I don't even have words for it in a human vocabulary. It is now all over the web as human safari. You can Google it and you see that it exists. Because the first reaction of a normal human being, what's normal? Okay, it's not normal, but somebody with healthy, more or less, a psyche, psychological health is, it is not possible. It's not possible for one human to hunt another human. And we spoke about that. You were one of the first three publication channels who believed me because we know each other for so long. You knew I wasn't some psycho making things up.
Well, so, I know the Russians. I know the capacity the Russians have for this kind of cruelty.
Exactly. So Byline Times, my newspaper I write for in London, amazing one. Euromaidan Press, Ukrainian and English, also great publication. And you were the ones who believed me and we broke the story. And then for a long time, 3 months, editors of major publications would not believe me and asked some proof. They asked for a video or a photograph, and it's, of course, impossible because, that would be your last photograph you'd ever take, a drone attacking you. And that's what's happening. To answer your question, it's on the rise, which is hard to believe because the numbers are already official numbers only, would be about 100 drones per day, like about 3,000 per month. And these are very low numbers because these are only the drones that were intercepted or destroyed or fell down or some malfunction, something happened to them. As somebody who lives in Kherson, central Kherson, close to the park, close to the river, I witness them just like anybody else in Kherson on an hourly basis. They're just buzzing there. It's hard to imagine. So 2 weeks ago, I was filming the artillery strike on a very famous, infamous, rather at this point, cathedral, Katerininsky Cathedral, where Potemkin's, Potemkin village, Potemkin bones used to be buried, and the Russians stole them. Like everything sounds like sci-fi.
Oh no, I spoke to We spoke to a monument, you basically a Ukrainian monumentsman, about the theft in the museums.
Yes.
I mean, there is no disputing that they're committing war crimes time and time and time again in Kherson.
And well, that particular one, bones. Why would you steal bones? They do it. They stole the bones, and now they bomb the cathedral. Permanently. It's not just one time, but the way it works in Kherson, the way you live in Kherson, is like that. So I'm in the morning. I have some time before an interview with a victim of a drone. So I step out to go for a walk. It's sunny. It's nice. And the lady at the corner store right in my building, who knows me, I know everyone there, say, "Hey, Zarina, did you hear that the Katerinsky Cathedral was bombed this morning at 6 a.m.? Did you hear it?" And we're right next to it. It's like, no, I was asleep. My plywood windows cover everything.
Yep. I know, and we've become used to it.
Fast asleep. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to go across the park to film it. And I'm telling you, and I probably said that before, but a walk in the park will never sound, the phrase will never sound to me again after living next to the park in Kherson. You walk through this park and it's terrifying because there's buzzing, it's creepy, or people are still walking their dogs there, but everything is looking like in Chernobyl Netflix series, because the trees are fallen, broken, and it's just horrifying. So, but it's about 10 minutes walk, if that, maybe 7. So I shoot through the park, going underneath the evergreens because the leaves are fallen, and I come to the cathedral. The cathedral is open, and there's a service going on. So the women are singing, the priest there. Here goes the myth, by the way, if you heard that Zelensky banned Orthodox religion, didn't ban anything. It's right there, being bombed by the Russians. The video, by the way, is on my Twitter. So I filmed that. I find the shrapnel from the shell that arrived, trying to decide whether it's Grad or some new Korean shells, like take it back to people who know it better than I do. While I'm doing it, and I head back, to go home and to my interview, I hear bzzz, and it sounds like one of the women I interviewed described it like millions of wasps, angry wasps or bees, something like that. But already it's there. And I hear it's not hunting me yet. I can tell by the sound whether it's after me or it's somewhere in the vicinity. And usually I have this little device I live with or walk with. There's Arrakis and Sukarok, and they're analyzer for drones in vicinity. Unfortunately, it analyzes all kinds of drones. And of course, Ukrainians are also flying drones. And I'll tell you something about that in a second. But I see how many drones are around. And if the drone is only within 1 minute range distance from me, it will go bzz, bzz, bzz. That day I forgot it because it's actually kind of useless because, I know they're there anyway. Yeah. So I just hid underneath the tree and recorded the sound. I didn't record the drone, that's suicidal, but I did record the sound. The video is on my Twitter, it's right there. So, and then you just rush through the park back. And of course, it's all a delusion because they can hit you outside of the park. On my street, it's there all the time. There are many people who were injured right there. That's how it goes.
Yeah. And I mean, they can even fly into apartment buildings or, hit with one drone, they hit and blast the window, and then the second drone comes through and kills civilians. But I want to talk about like the church and the morale and the situation, the ghost town aspect of Kherson. But before we move on to that, by now we have so much video. Maybe not of somebody filming a drone coming after them, although our mutual colleague Ken Robertson has that incident that got a lot of traction. But we're past that by now. Even if you're not filming an attack on you yourself, there's enough people with camera phones that have documented other people being attacked. This is indisputable in my mind. Why are we not getting traction in the Western press? This should be something that should be discussed repeatedly, ad nauseum. This is a war crime taking place every single day, and it seems that the West is just turning a blind eye? We know this is happening.
A great question. Let me address it. For one thing, you started by mentioning that drones can fly inside. They do that. I had people reporting to me happening to them in the suburb of Sadovo. Also in Nikopol, which is another town. It's close to Zaporizhia in Dnipropetrovsk region.
Wherever the line of fighting is close enough where they can still sit.
And they have particular techniques because this, of course, operated by pilots who could see it. Right. In Nikopol, they fly inside the windows way more than in Kherson.
Knowing full well what they're doing. They're killing civilians.
Yeah, they could see. So for someone who doesn't know, there's on the other side of the river, like anywhere from 1 kilometer to 5 kilometers away, and the drones can fly now up to 30 kilometers inland. There's a pilot who sees and video records what is happening. They know very well it's a woman, it's a child, it's a teenager on a moped. We had 2 of them this week, a few days ago, injured. And the question is, why doesn't it get more traction? And of course, by now, what Kaylin recorded was this buzzing of which I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I've recorded multiple times. What's hard to record is the drone flying at you. But at this point, the head of the suburb of Antonievka, Sergei Vashchenko, recorded it many times because he's out there with a gun. He shoots them down. The guy walks around with a gun and shoots them down. He was injured several times by now. I interviewed him several times. Absolutely fearless, like most Khersonians, of course, but he also protects other people. So what's the situation? At this point, I have a spreadsheet that a volunteer, wonderful French volunteer Xavier, helps to run. He checks the press every day for Kherson and Human Safari and collects them. At this point, we're getting close to 100 articles in all the major publications and at all the major broadcasting channels covering Human Safari. Starting when we first broke it with you from early August. It's a recorded thing. There are 2 major organizations. I can't tell you yet which ones, but they're major, preparing the reports on the war crimes that are about to be published. Why is it not known widely? Because I spoke to psychologists, and I believe, and they believe, rather, psychologists I interviewed, as you and I spoke in the first interview, that there is a barrier, there's a psychological defense. It's like with concentration camps during World War II. It's like with Holocaust, any kind of genocide, the psyche protects itself from such a trauma.
It's too horrible to believe.
It's too horrible to believe, and then the denial comes in as a defense mechanism, and they say it's not possible, they're making it up. However, the Russians themselves record. Right now they stop because they figured out that it's a war crime. But for as long as 6 months, there were several Russian Telegram channels proud of it. And we still have the screenshots, we still have the posts where say, look, we have attacked, and here is the video from the Russian side. We're attacking an ambulance, we're attacking a bus, we're attacking firefighters, first responders arriving at the site of the destruction. We have plenty of material. So it will be recorded, there will be tribunals, it's coming. It just with anything like that, Phil, as you and I know, things take time because and we are dealing with mentality and psychology here. Unfortunately, in journalism and in political science, it's underestimated. But I feel like we are and we'll talk about the hybrid war affair later, but psychology is becoming one of the most prominent fields here.
Yeah, and they're psychologically inflicting terror on the people of Kherson. This is purposeful because it's my belief, and I don't know if you fully agree with me or not. I'll defer to you. I think they're trying to empty the city. I think they're trying to terrorize the people of Kherson so that they will leave. And then once they have left, they'll be able to pummel it like they did with Mariupol. Evacuate the civilians, evacuate people, and then destroy the city. Are people in Kherson, what's the morale like? Are people leaving? Are people evacuating?
Yes.
I mean, there are strong people, as most Ukrainian cities are, but I love Kherson in many different ways. And one of them is the fact that they are very proud of their city. They're very civically minded. They're not stupid. They've got to know that that's what the Russians are trying to do, is to force them out. How are they holding up?
You are absolutely right. About a week ago or so, I did an interview with Alexander Prokudin, who is the head of the military administration. It's on Byline Times. It's in many ways, there are a lot of exclusive information there on drone warfare and the way that Ukrainian military and the local authority are working on confronting the situation and counteracting the drone attacks. They're not just sitting there waiting to be hit. There's a lot being done, and I'll cover it in a second. It's really interesting and creative. But speaking of the morale and of people of Kherson, you're absolutely right, and don't get me started. I'll spend the whole hour singing dithyrambas to the people of Kherson.
I love that
I've
city.
never seen anything like this. If you want to be inspired, just come to Kherson. And I was in Kyiv here doing a lot of meetings, running around, interviews and stuff, and people asking are you sure that it makes sense to say that they're actually going to yoga and theater premieres while they're under attack? And the Western audience will not believe that things are so bad if they see girls hanging upside down in the yoga studio. I'll tell you what, I've been there for 2 years. It is unbelievable, and that's the best representation of the morale and the spirit of Kherson. They are incredibly athletic. You see people, like retired people, exercising in that park I have mentioned, at the playgrounds where they have installed this outdoor equipment like we have in the West, right? Exercising with the sirens going on, artillery boom, and I have it all filmed, and there's a documentary I'm working on, which is forthcoming soon, and I will show it to the world, how people under not hourly, but every 5-minute artillery strikes manage not to just function, but to have fun, to live with dignity, to be creative. There are artists, there are poets, there are poetry readings. I write, so I go.
It's like this beautiful city. It's almost like a sanitarium because it's so leafy and green and vibrant.
In summer,
In summer, obviously, yes. But, that I think transfers to the people of Kherson as well. It's the healthiness and it's
so strong, so athletic, so in their body and in their spirit as well. So they gather together, although many times only a half of people who were meaning to come will come because they're either attacked by the drones or there's artillery strike going on. It happens all the time. But, everything is underground. So,
and the other thing I wanted to mention before we kind of move on to other topics aside from Kherson is that one thing that Westerners don't understand, or those out there being critical of people living their lives in Ukraine, especially in places right on the front lines, that's a form of defiance.
Of course.
That's a form of resistance.
Yeah. Yes.
To let the Russians steal from me my life, my normal life, my desire to be healthy, my desire to have a social life or do something, that's fighting back.
Of course.
Every time I hear this criticism, whether it's discos in Kiev or the beach parties in clubs Ibiza in Odessa, or whether it's the people out in Kharkiv.
Phil, I've been to a rave party in Kherson. Underground,
right.
And you won't find out until you're in it because it's Russians are targeted any gathering, but people are living the life. That's
fighting back.
That's fighting back, exactly, and that's how they feel. They are totally cognizant of that. They know what they're doing. They are defiant as hell. That's why I love it there. Yeah. And to answer your question, whether they are living, people with families living in the coastal areas are living because, yes.
They are leaving.
Yes. Well, it's impossible not to.
Yep.
Russians are weaponizing fear and they're destroying about 5 to 6 private houses by the river at night. I know this areas very well. I have many friends and people I've interviewed who live there. They have to flee because these areas are being turned in what you've seen of Mariinka, Avdiivka, Mariupol, and Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar. We can go
it's what they
forever.
do.
That's what they do, and I've seen the streets crumble, being turned into ashes. They do it on a daily basis, so people have to flee. Sometimes they move to what they call safer areas of Kherson, where the guided aerial bombs are now being used. Just yesterday, there were 8 guided aerial bombs dropped on Kherson, one of them downtown in the middle of the workday when people are still out. That's right in the heart of Kherson, damaging a lot. And then they followed up, and at night they dropped 7 more, and they killed one man. So the mother of this man, she lost one son. She only had 2, and she lost one at the front, and this one was going to go to the army, and he got killed inside. And there's this heartbreaking photographs by my colleagues who are there now, with this mother sitting on the site of destruction, having lost everything, and 2 sons. If that is not heartbreaking, I don't know what. But I've seen people like that refusing to move, saying, this is my city, this is my land, why should I go? They should go away. And
knowing the people of Kherson, I'm sure that they will last it. They'll take it and try as best they can to outlast and to resist against the Russians as long as they possibly can, because I see this similarly in another town that we both love, Odessa.
Exactly.
And Odessites are very similar in this mentality, and I don't think it's unique to either Kherson or Odessa. I think this is all around Ukraine. Again, this, I'm not going to let you Russian bastards fuck my life over. I'm gonna do the best I can to stay normal, to have a normal life. And from my mind, so moving on from Kherson, I think if they try and take Kherson, it'll be disastrous for them. Even if they are able to evacuate the city, even more than it's already happening, the Ukrainian armed forces will make them fight like hell for that city, Kherson, but even more so Odessa. Odessa is a freaking fortress. It will take hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, literally, to seize Odessa. It's every street corner. There's fighting positions and all the rest of it. So taking into consideration that Kherson isn't going to bend the knee easily or be taken away easily, Odessa for sure isn't going to be. Talk to me a little bit about the situation in Odessa.
Happily and gladly, because you know how much I love Odessa. It's my childhood, hometown. But just, I promise to mention how the city of Kherson is fighting their human safari.
Let's hear it.
Very briefly on that, according to Mr. Prokudin, there are all the innovations at work there, and there are drones with laser equipment cutting down on the fiber optic cables, because Russians are now flying on fiber optics.
So that it can't be blocked.
Avoid these frequency wars. There are gigantic drones with hooks, bigger, I shouldn't say gigantic, they are bigger drones with hooks that are actually flying there to cut the fiber optics. Frequency war we covered before, how they're changing frequency and fighting back and forth. There are fishing nets installed on important infrastructure objects or along the tunnels and the roads. That's being done in Donbass as well, to protect the road, to protect the infrastructure objects, so the drones simply get caught in the fishing nets. It's such a mind game.
They're so inventive.
There.
They're so inventive.
So they are not giving up anytime soon. And if any, one last thing I'll say about Kherson. On a daily basis, Russian troops are attempting a day and night to cross the river to get to the islands. They are being fought. They're being killed. It's called a suicidal ticket, one-way ticket. And I heard from the military there that the river is teeming with Russian bodies at the time. And they're still sending them, because if they don't go, the Russians would shoot their own. So
yes. Yeah, we have plenty of footage of that as well.
There's a lot of drama going on there. But if for some reason they're able to get even a tiny little piece of Khersonia land, every rock will fight them back. every leaf, every babushka, babusa will make a poison,
sticks and
borscht.
stones, and
every bird, every pigeon will fight them back. And I've seen those pigeons, they're Kherson war pigeon, biolab, Moving on to Odessa, which of course is also defined, but in its own way. I wrote an essay for Byline Times, a long one, more like a literary one, and I came up with this pohuism. Pardon my French, right. Ukrainian French, which is a philosophy. It's not a philosophy, it's a joke. But it's like the art of not giving, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, not giving a fuck.
Yes, that's the art of not giving a fuck, which I believe every region has its own character in Ukraine, which is a wonderful thing about this country.
Which is a wonderful thing about this country.
This is the most lackadaisical, most relaxed, most not giving a fuck, queen of not giving a fuck. I love telling this anecdote. I might have told you already. I'll tell it again because I love it. I was working at a cafe writing about bombings of Mykolaiv in 2022 in summer when I heard the huge blast, glasses flying by Langeron, by the beach, by the Black Sea. Everybody's there with the families, their dogs, balloons. It's such a festive atmosphere, summer. And everybody's starting to run. And I'm like, oh my God, finally I see Odessans reacting. And you know where they were running? They were running to take a selfie with the exploded. There was a missile taken down there. And as I run, there's a waiter and another guest, from the restaurant client running next to me. And he's going to the waiter, don't worry about it. We'll just take a picture. We'll come back. We eat, drink, and we'll pay. And so I did the same. I went back and finished my cocktail and that's Odessa.
I'll tell you a story.
Okay.
I was in Odessa one time when they hit right after you remember the Ukrainians denied an oil platform to the Russians out in the Black Sea, and the Russians were using it as a logical hub, as a kind of attack point. And the Ukrainians took it out, and it pissed off Moscow, so they shot a hypersonic missile at us, one of the first used in this war. And I was sitting at a little fish restaurant on the Corniche, lovely Odessa,
Yeah.
Boom! This thing hits, and it's. I don't know if you've been in a Kinjal yet. The hypersonic missile strike is very different than a normal artillery strike.
Of course,
it's something about the sound. It's something about it's different. It's all together different. Yeah. We all just kind of looked at one another. The waiter leaned out the balcony to look where the strike was, sort of thing, and just kept on,
Yeah. Well, that's exactly. To finish with the anecdote, the other time I saw Shahid. Of course, Odessa is being struck with Shahids a lot at night. Like from my window when I'm in Odessa, I live in this little attic. I don't know if you've been there, over the office. I love my view, the sea of roofs leading to the sea. It's just delicious, it's amazing. And then from my window at night, I see all those Shahids flying around. It's like they call it Star Wars. In Kherson, there's Star Wars with drones. In Odessa, it's the Star Wars with Shahid drones. Right. And you see, it's almost beautiful. You see these red dots. And one time I was in summer in Odessa on the phone with a friend and I laid down on the sand and I was just watching the sky. And I see a lot of stars and it's so beautiful, Phil. And then I see the stars are waltzing and dancing. And they're not stars. They're drones. All of them, there are few stars, of course, but most of them are something moving in the sky. It's just insane. The reality of the city at war. But then you look down and here they are selling shashliks, here they are drinking champagne and dancing. But of course, when you know people, you live here, you know that this group here celebrating and dancing, half of them are military who just having some time off with their wives back and it's their birthday. Yes. And then the other group sitting there having a little picnic at the beach. They just lost half of the family. Or there would be another group, which I spoke to. I remember there was a group of people and they, of course, Ukrainians are so generous. They always especially learning that you're a foreigner working here. It's here, have some watermelon, have some melon, sit down, eat with us, drink with us. They, push stuff in your pockets and, they're amazing people. And then you find out that they're from Mariupol, from Donetsk, and that they moved already 3 times, and half of their family was killed or tortured or are actually living in occupation. A lot of people have friends and families living under Russian occupation, and it's a terrible pain. They almost can't have any conversations because there's no connection, no mobile. It is, everyone in this country, even in lackadaisical Odessa, is affected. And it's hard to live, all night you hear shaheeds. Have you ever heard shahid? It sounds much worse than the regular FPV drones. It sounds like a goddamn moped is flying.
It's the mopeds.
To me, all the sounds, I can do a separate show
or
on
the
the
anti-aircraft
sounds.
fire. Or the,
Exactly. Right. Shahid to me sounds like a bunch of angry witches flying on motorized mops. It's such a nasty, disgusting sound. I didn't know that sounds could be disgusting before I heard Shahid, right? Or the sirens when it's howling and howling to me. And they're
you're
different.
Right, the sounds
in
of war,
every city, the siren sounds different.
Slightly different.
Like in Odessa, the sound of siren, I actually wrote about it. It inspires me. It sounds like a hungry dragon howling, every time. In Kherson, it's not like this. It's more, it's less pronounced. I can define it. But in Kharkov, actually, it was almost funny because I think it sounded so much that it was a tight sound. It sounded like somebody clearing their throat, like almost.
Well, that would be appropriate for Kharkiv as well.
In Kramatorsk, too. I once remember with my colleague Don Arles from TVP World, we were in Kramatorsk, and the siren started, and we just started to laugh because it was like this. Ooh, and I mean, the reality here is
you can't survive without a little bit of black humor. You can't survive without denying them the right or the power over your life, to steal away your life. That's a form of resistance as well. So again, another reason why I can't bear those people who are sitting in their comfortable couches in wherever saying, look at these Ukrainians, they're not really suffering. There's also there's also an aspect of it that's almost sad, out of desperation, that they're desperate to have fun. They're desperate. I have walked the streets of, obviously I spend most of my time now in Kiev, where prior I kind of traveled around doing vlogging and stuff. Now I've got the show, so I'm here most of the time. But I walk around the streets of Kiev, and I know a lot of people have been critical about like the kids on the street drinking and having fun on a Friday or Saturday night. What they don't pick up on is something that you can't pick up on unless you're here, and there's a sadness right beneath the surface. They're drinking to excess. I'm sure they're having lots of sex. I'm sure these kids want to feel something other than the war. So while a video camera may capture the party, in quotation marks, on the street, if you're here and you know these people, it is only right beneath the surface where it's not the party. It's deep trauma and fear and pain. And I wish that could be communicated better.
Of course, and you're so right about it. We are in a place where, and it's rarely being spoken about, where it's a part of life. Sex becomes a way of denial, and also the way of defiance,
and to feel something other than
to
pain
feel
and suffering.
alive.
Yeah.
Actually, in fact, there are a lot of babies being born in Kherson. In Kherson, there are a lot of pregnant ladies, and they want to have these babies.
Sure.
And I've interviewed people, and they say, they're killing us. We need to procreate. We need to sustain our nation. And it's like, in America, it's different, right? Like I lived most of my life in America. We plan, we decide whether it's the right moment. Oftentimes we decide not to have children because, there are all these factors. None of this works here. Here it's the celebration of life, celebration of the nation, celebration of victory, of the future. And it's mind-blowing, especially for us, living living in the West, of being used to living in the West, this gigantic mentality gap, which thankfully somebody like you, Phil, who lived a lot in post-Soviet space, is trying to close the gap and or at least explain how it works. And here's something I want to mention, because I know I get excited, and this is a less formal show, so it's nice to be able to just chat and share the anecdotes and stuff. But there, it's not like there are no negative. There are a lot of negative. And one of the things about Odessa and attacks on Odessa, it's not just Kinzhals, Iskanders, Shaheeds, or missiles and nightly attacks, or Odessa being cut from electricity, like in the winter of 2022, when we all lived in the cold rooms where I would wake up and see steam coming out of my mouth. Yeah. And there was no internet. It was really hard to live and work there, but sustainable. What's much worse is they know Odessa. They know how, free-minded and whatever it is. So they are targeting it. And this is something that we are going to eventually come to, rounding this all up. They are waging the mind war, the information warfare, like nowhere else probably I see it raging in Odessa. Odessa and Kherson are historically, traditionally, are more Russian-speaking, which is also not the indication of them being pro-Russian. No. There are so many Russian-speaking soldiers at the front who are giving their lives voluntarily for Ukraine, but they were just raised speaking Russian because Ukrainian
you see it in Kharkiv as well.
Was being destroyed. Yeah, there are many areas. There are many areas where they only speak Ukrainian, and there are many areas where they only speak Surzhyk, which is a dialect, and something like in between. But in Odessa, we're talking about Odessa now, they traditionally speak Russian, although they all speak Ukrainian. They all can speak Ukrainian, and they do. But the Russians are using it, and they are pushing the incredible amount of disinformation, disorienting information, fakes on Odessa specifically, also exploiting Odessan flair for all things cultural. Odessa takes pride in being, in a way, cultural capital of this, at least south, if not all of the Ukraine. They have of course, Odessa is famous. Odessa has a reputation in the world for its literature, for its theater, for its
the Opera House
cinema.
There is one of the most beautiful places.
Battleship Potemkin has started the films, and the Eisenstein. There's so much Babel opera, you said.
The first film studio in Imperial Russia was not in Moscow, it was in Odessa.
In Odessa, yes. Yeah. And actually our first film was premiered there, and my second film will be premiered there. It's an amazing place with a museum.
It is.
And Odessans take pride in it.
Yeah.
And so that's where Russians are immediately jumping in, as they do everywhere, and we'll talk about that, and they're exploiting the difference. And Ukraine is a very democratic, open society where everybody is outspoken, and as a rule, everybody hates authorities, usually, unless somebody else attacking the authorities. Then all Ukrainians will stand up for them, just with Zelensky. They are happy to hate their power, unless somebody else is hating them. Then they're ours. We'll hate them. You don't touch Zelensky or anybody else. Yeah, that's ours. But and so they're what they call, there's a word for it. Can I again? Srach, which is something like a shitstorm. They're this horrifying shitstorm, especially with a person with Western mentality. You read it and they're online, and you feel like, oh, these people are just the throats. They're about to kill each other, shoot each other, knife fight, and then next thing you know, they're drinking beer together, and that's just all in the family, like Italian, kind of thing. Yeah. And for me, like arriving, now I'm used to it, but arriving first was like, oh my God, these people hate each other, and they don't, but they're very open and eager to express their
fiercely independent,
radical,
very fiercely opinionated. There's a lot of that.
And Russians are using it to split them and to actually drive this discord further, split Odessa and undermine it, particularly this city, to implant these narratives,
Yes.
and they're using culture, they're using Pushkin, who is very the most glorified, iconic poetry figure. Aside, it has nothing to do with Pushkin or his poetry. It's just a figure or a name which is being weaponized like everything else. Like for Russia, you have to understand, ideology doesn't exist. They will go for communists, they will go for Nazis, they will go for oligarchy, they will go for Mao Zedong. They don't care. As long as they can ride on it, they will exploit it.
As long as they can have power. And as long as they can gain power and use it the way they'd like to apply power. They look at things very differently. And I know that they look at Odessa as theirs. They're very much like, that is our city. We built that. Catherine established it. That's their opinion. I don't think that's true, but that's their mentality. And their mentality is that it is rightfully ours. But also in addition to that, they need it to control the Black Sea coast, which so much of this war is all about. Strategically, the Black Sea fleet right across the water there in Crimea, in Sevastopol, will never be able to function as a seaport again unless they can take Odessa. And they're not going to do it. They don't have the means to do it. You live there. I've been there many times. I know the resilience. I know the strength. I know the defenses. They would have to have a third, fourth, who knows how many more mobilizations to take Odessa. And that includes having to go through Kherson first.
Exactly.
They don't have the capacity to do it. They just don't. And having been in Odessa, and I know that's why they're doing that with the psychological warfare, because they can't take it militarily. But if they can divide and conquer, as so much they do, that's what they intend to do with Odessa. And I don't think it's going to work.
Absolutely, Phil. And this is the most excellent point. And that was the plan in the very beginning.
Yes,
and they acknowledged to that. They were going through Kherson, capture Kherson, move on to Mykolaiv. And actually, Kherson played such an important strategic role there because it stopped the residents of, say, Belozerka, which is a small suburb next to Kherson. They stopped, literally, physically, the Russian troops and the Russian hordes of moving to Mykolaiv, which was then pummeled and bombed for about 9 months until the Russians were kicked back across the Dnipro. And the intent was to go through Mykolaiv to Odessa, and from there on Transnistria and Moldova,
and moving completely off from the Black Sea.
And then they were going to move on to Europe. So in a way, this whole southern, shall we call them triangle, or that whole southern area stopped Russians from moving on to Europe. And that's why they wanted back. And you're absolutely right, because they want the control of the Black Sea for many purposes, from military to economic. It's such an important strategic point. And yes, they can take it militarily because their fleet has been destroyed. And now they are trying to use what they do the best. And they still, unfortunately, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine probably is the only country, plus Estonia or Finland, who's standing up in the field of the information warfare. Our country, the United States, has nothing on them in the field of information warfare.
No, we are losing that war badly.
Europe is struggling, and so thank God for the former Eastern Bloc countries who understand what they're dealing with. But even in Odessa, it's a fight, and I'm very concerned about it, and that needs to be acknowledged.
I think ultimately, though, after so much pain and suffering inflicted upon the city by the Russians, we've talked about how opinionated Odessites can be. They have turned public opinion and against themselves by killing Odessites, and I don't think that's going to be forgotten anytime soon. Odessites can also be very stubborn. But moving on off of Odessa, because you already brought up now how they operate in a larger aspect. In the former Soviet Union, in Europe, in America, they run this hybrid war where they get inside your mind first, and they hope that by doing that, they'll never have to fire a shot because we'll turn on ourselves. We'll divide ourselves. You're aware of that, I'm sure, in Europe and in America, but you've also spent a lot of time in Georgia recently, another country that I dearly love. Georgia is one of the most delightful places and a secret hidden spot. Don't go. Do go. Check it out. But try and keep it secret. Don't spoil it for the rest of us. I love Georgia. I love Georgians. I love a supra, which is a feast. I love their culture, their music, their resilience. They are on the street at the time of this recording. I think it's 105 nights or something like that. They have been going out in the cold in massive numbers. You were there. Tell me about Georgia.
Absolutely. It's impossible not to love Georgia. Once you're there, you fall in love. You'll fall in love with the food. You'll fall in love with the nature, with the architecture, with people.
Music.
It is unbelievable. Even if something bad happens to you there, which did happen to me, and I was open and spoken about it. As a teenager, I was kidnapped, and then really bad things happened to me. And it's still impossible not to love it because, there are idiots and bad people in every nation. But overall, it is just, like Phil is saying, go, but don't spoil it. I appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah.
Also Georgians, they're so sophisticated. There are only 4 million of them. It's a very small country.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be defined by their cuisine, which is hard because the cuisine is so good. Every restaurant here, which is not Ukrainian, is Georgian here in Kiev. And it's like the most delicious food, which, if I'm giving up my figure, it would be only for the cheese pies of Georgia. I can't stop eating them. Anyway, moving on from, they don't want to be defined in the state of Hachapuri, which is a cheese pie.
Right.
But their tradition of greeting the guests with the most delicious food, the supra.
The idea of hospitality is intrinsic to them. I think they really, and that says something about their character beyond just the food.
I've interviewed this one restaurant owner and winemaker who said it's in our DNA. We are defined by this national code of supra, of this greeting the host. And by the way, if you didn't know, because sometimes it's hard to, there are a lot of countries in the world. There's a small country. It's in Caucasus. It's a Christian country,
very religious.
Right next to Armenia, which is another Christian nation, surrounded by mostly Muslim nations. So in a difficult situation, always has been a transportation hub. It's been always on the way, or on the Silk Road, from China to all the way to Europe, and all the spices and silks.
And they lie between the Persian Empire and the Russian Empire on that little isthmus between the seas.
Yes.
So strategically very important.
Exactly. Between Caspian and Black Sea.
Yes.
And there's a lot of oil in the region, which goes through. So a lot of countries at the moment, just as it was throughout history, are interested in Georgia, which, by the way, is one of the most ancient cultures and countries in the world, and also a birthplace of winemaking.
Yep.
I don't have any time to go into Georgian history.
We absolutely could.
Some
we
other
could talk
time.
about Colchis and the golden fleece, because that's how they used to mine for gold.
Yeah,
and that's a Greek legend tying them to the West. So it defies Moscow's narrative that it's in their satellite.
Yes, it was the Colchid, the state of Colchid, described by Ovid, described by the Greek myths and so forth. I can go about that
we both
forever.
could.
I wrote about it quite a bit. If you're interested, I'm sure a lot of other people did too. But for Byline Time and for Euromine, I wrote a lot of articles about that. So inspiring. Anyway, but at the moment, the situation, I spend all the time there running, interviewing people throughout the day, anybody from ambassadors to journalists to tour agencies, owners and bakers. I don't know, pretty much everyone I could. And at night, I would go and join the protests. And at this point, the government, Ivanishvili's government,
the
pro-Russian,
Georgian dream,
which they call Russian nightmare. That's referred to as, which wasn't that openly pro-Russian right away when they appeared on the political scene in 2012. They gradually changed. And again, we won't go into every detail, but by this point, they became openly and broadly pro-Russian. And they take in every Russian law of suppression that the Russians have from foreign agents, that the NGOs in the newspapers, media cannot have any grants from abroad anymore, which of course is undercutting democracy, because this is a very poor country after it's split from the Soviet Union then, and then being constantly in opposition with Russia, it lost a lot of its well-being. It's a poor country, especially in the country. You wouldn't know that in Tbilisi. It looks like a very well-off city, but, step aside and there's still hunger in the villages, and there would be no electricity and so forth. So there were a lot of programs from European Union and from USAID.
Right.
We'll wait on that. And these programs are undercut by the Georgian government and now by the American government and any government in sight. And so the people themselves are so pro-European, so pro-democratic. They're so well-educated. My God, Ukrainians are very well-educated, but they are more into speaking Ukrainian now. They speak English, but not as many. In Georgia, it was easy to work. I don't speak Georgian. I speak Ukrainian, I speak Russian, but I don't speak Georgian, and I didn't want to speak Russian there, sure as hell. But everybody speaks English. And they
it's a
speak
very international
so fluently
society.
and so well, and they are very modest. When you tell them, oh my God, there are a lot of students there, and it's like, I'm in awe at how, the broadness of knowledge, and they say, oh, we're not, we just, we were not at all. I mean,
well, they like many Ukrainians are looking forward to a time when they're not living under Moscow's thumb. So of course it's students who are taking to the streets, but not just. I've seen all strata are out on the streets. And in a country of 4 million people, to have that consistent, those thousands and thousands of people on the streets in Tbilisi, it really does show that they're rejecting Moscow, much like they're doing that here in Ukraine. And the ties are very tight between Georgia and Ukraine. But Georgia's a different situation as well because they're more isolated. Ukraine has the benefit of being right on Europe's doorstep. Georgia is small and it's far away. There's no direct tie to Europe unless you want to talk about Turkey, which isn't adequate.
Parts of Georgia are still occupied by Russia. 20% of territories in Abkhazia and parts of Ossetia are occupied by Russians. They are not recognized as autonomous entities by anyone by Russia, and they certainly are not recognized as such by Georgians. They are very rebellious and very angry about that.
No, I absolutely. What's the mood amongst the Georgians? Because we talked about the hybrid war, which is a mind game. It's propaganda. It is manipulating your perception of reality. Georgians know this. Baltic state countries know this. Scandinavian countries are increasingly becoming aware of it. Of course, we here in Ukraine are well aware of it. But I'd like you to talk a little bit, as we wind up with Georgia, about how they are resisting and what your anticipation for how that resistance is going to go. But then let's transition into talking about this hybrid war that's going on globally.
Yes, and Georgia is a perfect way to transition into the whole European and the global hybrid warfare because there in Georgia, just as in Ukraine, the Kremlin is exploiting their mental weaknesses and the national character and the national myths and narratives. They also use Ukraine in a way to scare, to weaponize fear. During the election campaign for Russian Nightmare Georgian Dream Party, which is now the ruling party, they would be showing the terrible visuals of Ukrainian cities being bombed and destroyed, saying, do you want it to happen to you? Like basically you piss off Russia and that's what they'll do to us. And of course people could be motivated by fear, by avoiding the fear. It's just a natural instinct to be, to protect
prey on it.
yourself.
I mean, that's their...
So they weaponize fear.
Also, by the way, taking away agency from Russia. that Russia will be forced to destroy
yes.
us.
Oh,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
which is
Yeah,
something they use
of
regularly
course.
as well.
They use, so there are several trends.
We don't want to hurt you, but
Yeah,
if you go against Moscow's way, we're going to have to bomb you and kill your children.
Yeah, what a wonderful little country you have there. It's such a shame if something happens.
Exactly.
So there is that. Then they, as you have mentioned, this country is very religious. A lot of people have a lot of respect for church, even though the religion was banned in the Soviet Union for 70 years. But Georgia is defined by its Christianity and its Orthodox culture because, like I said before, it's surrounded by the Muslim cultures. So that's its identity.
Yes.
So it's being used, and then the democratic values are being devalued, tautology
On
intended, because they said, look at them, look at all the LGBTQ movements.
Yeah, and also look how sloppy they are. They argue amongst themselves. They go through these silly processes of votes and things like that. But the ethical stuff with the religion.
Also weaponizing homosexuality issue itself.
Yes.
And
look at the decadence of the West.
Decadence, it's against the Bible and so forth. So that is their family values. They're one of their favorite things. And then they're being very creative. The society being so educative. The protesters are very creative. I'll give you a very short anecdote because it really was amazing. So there were judges who just convicted the protesters to some unjust terms in prison, like very long-term sentences. And then they decided to have a banquet, one of the supras, for the Old New Year holiday in a restaurant downtown Tbilisi. It's like off downtown, in this glass building where they had this traditional spread banquet feast. At that time, all the protesters came there, surrounded the building, basically sieged the building, and the judges couldn't leave. And so when I arrived with the companions, it was very cute. They were nice. They were young students, like 19, 20-year-old students.
And it wasn't violent. We need to stress that. It wasn't violent. They were embarrassing them.
Yeah, who were protecting me from the police. So we all arrived there as a group, and I like to run and film. I have the video, with the special forces and the police, and these boys are around, kind of like also we're all running. And meanwhile, the protesters are throwing eggs at the window, and the judges pull down the curtains, and it's like a totally Marie Antoinette moment when we see the shadows rushing back and forth. It's so cinematic, and we see like little holes in the curtains, and they're looking through, peeking, and we're still there, and the eggs are flying, and they're crying, shame, shame, and eventually the special forces figured out how to do it, and they went like wall to wall. They pushed the protesters to the side, and then through this narrow tunnel, they rushed the judges out, and they were paraded in their outfits, like designer clad, like in this
so glamorous
shiny,
and chic,
and they had
rich,
to run like this, covering their head, while everybody was screaming at them. And that's how creative people are. They're also very theatrical in a way. They march with flags and flowers. They use fireworks, which are banned, and they're
traditional Georgian dress.
But also non-traditional. They had protests of every group possible. Harry Potter fans is the one that stuck in mind. The March of Pharmaceutical Industry Workers, McDonald's workers, Fathers and Sons March, Fishermen and Hunters March. Every night they would come up with something different, and it was all fun and great. And of course, for reporting, that was the best.
Sure.
It's so cinematic. But I spoke to the friends I made, this young men who were there. Of course, by now it's 107th day, I believe.
Yeah.
Over 3 months. And in the beginning, in December, the government, Ivanishvili's government, the Georgian Dream, were suppressing the protests heavily. The protests really started not after the election, but on the 28th of November, when the newly picked, is he president or prime minister, the former football player, who was picked almost to provoke.
Oh, the president.
Yes,
and then
the president.
The legitimate president, she refused to sit down. stand down.
So that he announced that the all EU cooperation on the course to become a part of EU would be stalled and halted until 2028, I believe, for many years. And that's when it exploded and people started to protest in the streets. And then they have two requirements. One, to free the political prisoners, of which there are about 500. I understand that 50 of them were badly tortured and injured. And during those suppressions, a lot of people were injured really badly. And so these young people who were fighting then at the time, they in a way are angry and want the protest to be more violent and almost be like Maidan in Ukraine. And then there's a majority, including the opposition leaders, who are still doing it in a peaceful way. And the question arises here, and, you know, I'm a journalist and observer. I film it, but I'm a person with a view. So my own questioning was, can you ever win against Russians by singing songs and, you know, carrying flowers? The answer is no. Yeah. So I'm not the one to tell any of these people what to do.
Non-violent resistance for Moscow.
In my personal opinion, the young people, and as a result, because the Maidan is not happening, some of the students are becoming very bitter, and I don't know where it will end up. There is this opposition and, you know, almost like a stalemate at this point. At some point, some of the experts told me the Georgian government, Ivanishvili's government, might want to provoke the protesters to do something violent in order to ask Russia to pull in the troops. And I could see...
That's my concern as well.
That it is possible. Because one of the other demands of the protesters is free the political prisoners and re-election. But the question is, the re-election will give the same results. They won't have the international observers now. The international community is too busy being screwed up on every single front in Europe and America. It's not the focus of the global attention right now.
No. Yeah, I'm worried about blood on the streets of Georgia as well, but I also know that they're not going to just take it. So you talk about how screwed up things are in the West, and as we kind of draw to a conclusion here with our lovely conversation, and again, thank you for coming, we need, you and I, we are both journalists. I'm hopefully on my way to retiring and never seeing another war ever again in my life.
Good luck.
I've had enough. Thank you very much. But this is my last war. But I feel compelled to be here because I think this is incredibly important, not only for this country or the countries of the former Soviet Union, but for the Western world, because we're under attack. And it's our responsibility as journalists, because I think the press corps, the International Press Corps and the English-speaking press corps is letting things down. They're almost criminally, if it could be a chargeable offense, criminally negligent in their coverage of what's happening here. This isn't just happening in Ukraine. It's not just happening in Georgia. It's not just happening in the Baltic states or even Belarus, which if we had the time, we could talk about extensively. What do we do to tell Westerners, Americans, Western Europeans, you guys, this isn't passive. You're involved. We're at war. And if it's only just a war for your mind right now, a hybrid war, eventually it might turn to violence because that's what they do. Like in Georgia, you're explaining the divisions that they're sowing and the tensions that are just in your mind right now, but ultimately could lead to bloodshed. What can we do to tell our fellow citizens in the West, wake up?
Well, absolutely, Phil. And for one thing, there's so many important points here. I'll try to be logical and go from one to one. First of all, I'm so glad that you decide not to retire yet, which I don't think you should. You're young and powerful and brilliant.
I'm not going to fully retire.
Right.
I'm just going to transition from war and tragedy to lovely things like the Great Lakes or my adoration of the Pacific Coast Highway.
That's a great plan, and I totally support you, and I hope it happens.
After this war.
Yes, and I'm very thankful to you for doing this, for running the shows, for then delivering them into the information space, because there's one thing to report, another thing to deliver the message. We have to jump obstacles as journalists. As somebody like Phil has to promote the show, not just film them, not just provide the content, but then make sure that the content reaches the audience. Somebody like myself and my colleagues who are either freelance journalists or journalists working for publications publications have to convince our editors that what we see indeed is true. And then the editors have to convince the audience that it is important to read these articles, to know this material, because as we have mentioned before, there's a denial and defense mechanism jumping in, and we have to overcome them. And we also are competing, and it's in a way, it's a very uneven and unjustful competition with the Russian multi-billion-dollar propaganda industry that has been developed close to 100 years. Yet, because when the Soviet Union fell, there was just a very short pause, like a breathing break. And then they almost didn't stop it. They resumed at pushing the information warfare materials on the unsuspecting Western audiences. And I'm a good person to talk about that, because as Phil knows, and as I've been talking about widely and openly for years, for decades by now, I was forced to study the Russian combat propaganda called spetspropaganda in the Leningrad State University. I was born in the Soviet Union, hence the accent. I lived in the United States and California most of my life, but as a young person, there was no escape. There was no way out, and there was no choice. I studied literature. My specialty was American literature. My thesis was in Scott Fitzgerald and William Blake. But because we spoke English, we were forced, in order to graduate and in order to study, to take this classified combat propaganda class. So I unfortunately slept through most of it, and it interests me the least of all things in the world. Now I regret it. I wish I remembered every word. I remember enough because we had to pass an exam in order to graduate. And there was a long course, 4 years. You haven't heard about it because, as far as I'm aware, only 2 people spoke about it openly. One is a former correspondent and chief editor of Kommersant Russian newspaper who now resides in Israel, Vladimir Yakovlev. Another person is, you're listening to, is me, Zarina Zabrisky. And we were forced to engineer narratives as political technologists, as military propagandists, to fuck, with your mind. Yeah. Because there's no other way I can say it.
No, it's exactly what they do.
It's, on the one hand, it's very straightforward. On the other hand, it's as convoluted as it gets. And because it's dealing with the brain refuses to incapacitated to process it. It's one of the tricks with psychology. And unless you are a trained political technologist or trained psychologist, a part of your brain will refuse to deal with this information.
Yes.
And
that's on purpose. That is a technique. That is a well thought out technique that they tell you one thing and then the other thing, and you're getting pushed and pulled, and you don't know where the truth is, and you always are off your equilibrium, so you don't know what to believe, and then they'll subsequently use your confusion to pitch you against your fellow citizens and to create tension and division.
Exactly, and that's generalization. There are actually a number of political technologies. Just like with any engineering, they are precise tactics and moves used to manipulate your brain. And I gave courses on that. I tried to make this broad knowledge for 10 years from San Francisco, in New York, and London. The courses online, presentations, PowerPoints, articles I made. I actually was threatened. They tried to silence me. Not very hard, but they did. And also, unfortunately, the major obstacle I had is this lack of readiness to accept that it could happen. And because it messes with especially American, but also European and British identity, to acknowledge that a third world country, such as Russia, could mess and meddle in their own words. Vladislav Surkov, who is who used to be an aide to Putin, said, "We don't meddle with your referendums and elections. We meddle with your minds, within your minds." And that's what they do, using the number of techniques and tactics. There's an article in Byline Times which lists just very few of those tactics, how exactly it's done. And for example, I give you an example from Georgia, propaganda move that they came up with is that there is this, it's an old narrative. There is a global secret government, a war party that is actually in charge of everything in this world. Here comes a hint at the Jews, but it's not that open. It's just some overall global
the
group,
globalists, quote unquote.
Yes, who are influencing everybody. The American president, the Russian president, Ukrainian, Georgian, and so forth. And they won the war. And that inflicting fear, making people insecure about the whole overall global situation, and so forth. Bizarre as it is, it's like almost, yesterday I was speaking to somebody about lizard people or flat earth.
Yeah.
But the lie is so big that it works. And the big lie is one of the tactics.
They love the conspiracies. They love
yes.
fomenting conspiracies.
Okay, speaking of conspiracies, the reason what I'm telling you now sounds so much like a conspiracy theory is because it is based on conspiracies. The nature of the KGB or FSB, which is the Russian security, Soviet security
SVR.
services, active measures, which is the campaigns and the number of operations, multifaceted operation, which we now call hybrid warfare, is based on conspiracies. It's all secret. There's a broad network of agents and assets that have been cultivated for decades, for 40 years, for 50 years, some of the sleepers. And right now, there are more and more information and allegations coming out about Trump being compromised in such a way. There's a lot of investigations going on,
yes.
and it needs, in the interest of public scrutiny, it needs to be looked at and developed further.
If only the fact that he is regurgitating Kremlin lies in the Oval Office, that alone is bad enough. But I agree with you. I think there's far more going on, and I think we need to have a full investigation.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. We won't have hard evidence.
You're never going to get hard evidence because that's the Russians won't allow it. It's the attack program is made so that it is always deniable. I talk an awful lot when people will let me when I'm out speaking to people about the situation here and about the former Soviet Union. I often refer to Mikhail Lesin. When Mikhail Lesin was Putin's spin doctor. At the tail end of the Soviet Union, he was the one that perfected the weaponization of they know that we're lying to them, and they don't believe a word we say. So what we're going to do is we don't have to make them believe any one thing. We just have to make them disbelieve everything, and not have a belief in any one single thing. And that was weaponized, and he was a big part of it. And the reason why I bring him up is because he died in Washington, D.C.
He was killed.
The year before Trump began his political campaign, on the eve of going and talking to U.S. law enforcement about something. We'll maybe never know what that is. But you're right. I agree with you. He died under very suspicious circumstances, multiple wounds to the head in his hotel room.
He broke his neck in his hotel room.
Yeah,
but he was also behind the idea of RT, Russia Today. He was the engineer of that. And he was one of these political technologists. And I know people who knew him, so I have, probably a conversation for some other time. But people like Mikhail Lesin and or Surkov or Dugin or other individuals,
yes, right.
They are behind, and generally the Kremlin, right? Behind what I want to present to you in a nutshell, because we don't have time to go into details.
There's a lot to talk
about. It's called in Russian, there's the word mnogohodovochka. It's a hell of a word and a mouthful. And it is it's a brainful, in a way, because it is a long-term, very long-term. When we're talking long-term, many decades, maybe 50 years or 40 years, multifaceted operation which encompasses the whole world. Globally, there are so many countries involved, and there are. economy, there is a political landscape and scene, there is culture weaponized, there are individuals, assets, sleeper agents, useful idiots, and of course media, very important part of it. All of those elements, security services and army are all involved. It's not one particular thing that is happening at the time. So therefore, when Phil and I are talking about Kherson and then Odessa and then Georgia, and I wanted to speak about Germany, where I went on the day when the conservatives teamed up with the Nazi for the first time and the firewall fell. All of this, including our situation in the United States with the White House behaving like the Kremlin asset, it all is one broad picture, and that's a part of this многоходовочка or multi-step operation. And it's almost impossible to conceive because it is so gigantic and sounds so conspiratorial.
Yep.
But you have to
understand. And the magnitude of it is so difficult to process.
That people we are speaking about, mainly the Russians in charge, are formed by the not just decades, but the hundreds of years of conspiracies. That's Russian culture. That's Russian mentality. You spend a lot of time there. We work together. We didn't mention it. You know, we met a long time ago. And I, unfortunately for myself, I'm not ethnically Russian, but I grew up there. And I know it very, very well. I've seen it in action. And for somebody who lives in the West, which is also me, I lived in the West most of my grown-up life, it's almost impossible to believe that anything like this is possible. But here we have, again, this mentality gap. Mind the gap, as they say in London. Mind the gap. It's there. We need to merge it. We need to realize that we're dealing with a mind war. I've been saying this for years. Yeah. And to conclude that, there's an article about многоходовочка in Byline Time I recently, which was recently published. But there's a very old metaphor that I use, and I think it's one of the best I come across to. It's there's a red wasp. A wasp that injects poison in its victim, which usually is a spider. And the spider is still alive, but it's paralyzed. And then the red wasp would lay the eggs and use the spider body, whole body, which is still alive and functions, but absolutely disabled. And has no paralyzed agency. It becomes as this breeding Trojan horse of ideas and the new wasps. And that's what the mind war is. I know it's horrifying, and I'm not trying to terrify you on purpose, although I'm demonstrating you how they work. Because once you're terrified, you are right now very vulnerable to ideas being incepted to a brain, and this is physiology. And this is one of the tricks they use. So I now can incept basically any idea in your head, but I am not a propagandist, so I will stop here. And I will call for anyone who listens through the end to do your own research, to use your critical thinking, verify everything that Phil, myself, or anybody else is saying. Google, verify what you're Googling. Don't rely on artificial intellect like ChatGPT or Grok, because there's a lot of mistakes there. And use your intellectual capacity to withstand this mind war, because we humans are very susceptible to ideas, foreign ideas, being incepted into us, and then we're becoming the weapons and part of this многоходовочка. And this is what Phil and I are fighting here.
That's right. And it's another just quick thing to add is that if you are responding with fear or anger or any strong emotion, you might be being manipulated, because that's what they do. Get you off balance, get you afraid, get you emotional, get you angry, and then they manipulate you. So always take a breath, read beyond the headlines, read beyond the top, find reliable, trustworthy sources of information, not just Zarina or myself. There's folks out there fighting this good fight, but we have to fight this fight. So also, to get this to other people, to spread this information as much as possible. We'll have links to Zarina's works in Byline and other outlets. And here, of course, if you would click the subscription button, the alarm button, that will help spread word of On the Edge. We're going to continue to have wonderful guests like Zarina, but we're in an information war, people. And that's why Zarina and I are doing what we can, and there are others likewise doing it, but be conscious of it, because your future, your children's future, relies upon it, and we are right at a moment in time where this war in Ukraine may be the hot side of a war against Moscow's attempt for dominion. We've heard Vladimir Putin say Russia has no borders, that we can expand as far as we want because our, great Russian culture and Russian soul, allows us to become, to have dominion over the world. We say no, because Zarina and I, we know what it's like to live under Moscow's cruelty, and we're not going to let it happen. So unless there's something like you'd like to add quickly, I think...
Echo on what you're just saying. Russia without borders includes your brain. Protect your brain. Think about it. Take a breath. And know that we are in a hybrid warfare. And hopefully it will be over soon with the complete victory of democracy, Ukraine, and everything we are standing for. Thank you very much for being here. It means a lot that you are here, listening, paying attention. Let's fight through the end.
All right. Thanks, Zarina. Thanks so very much.
Thank you, Phil.